Ehrman says that by virtue, and I think it's on the last page of his book on misquoting Jesus, he says, by virtue of reading a text, you necessarily change it. Well, Tom Howe, being the Tom Howe that he is, the one that we all love and know so well, asked him at the debate, well, if we read a text and by virtue of reading it, change it, how can I know what your book says? And you could hear people saying, what? And you can hear some atheists like, oh boy. And in that section of the room anyway. And his response was, well, that's just the nature of communication. Email me, we can talk about it. He was trying to get out of that because he
let's take that into the DMs. Yeah, right. Let's go private.
So, but Tom said, I'm gonna have to read your email. So where do we stop with this nonsense?
Yeah.
Putting ourselves. So people who say this want to apply it to the Bible, but not to themselves.
Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where it's always my goal to help equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And today's discussion is all about history. Maybe you've heard something like this. Have you heard somebody say, well, I can't know if Jesus was resurrected from the dead because I wasn't there? Or maybe you've heard somebody say something like, well, I don't know if it really matters that Adam and Eve were real historical figures because we can't really know history. It goes back so far. There's no way to know these things. So let's just pull the morality out of the tales that we can. Have you heard people say we can't even know history at all? What does it mean to be objective versus subjective? And another one that we tackle in today's episode is the idea that you can have your interpretation of the Bible, I can have a different one, and there's no objective standard by which to say that one person is right and one person is wrong. That's just your interpretation. We are talking about all of it today with an expert guest, Dr. Brian Huffling. But I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by bravebooks.com, which is a Christian children's entertainment company. You can go to bravebooks.com/childers for 20% off your first purchase. Before we get into today's conversation, I do want to remind you that we just announced very exciting news that we have a new student edition of my best-selling first book called Another Gospel coming out on October 21st. You can already pre-order the book. Pre-orders are really important because it signals whatever media outlet you buy your books from that, hey, this is an important book. People are interested in this. Maybe we should order some more. Let's maybe even push it forward in our algorithms. All of that is so helpful just by pre-ordering the book. So that's something you can do to help the book launch today. But another thing you can do that I'd really love my regular listeners to do is to share about this book. Let your friends know about it, whether that's on social media. Maybe you can email your pastor, let them know that we have a student version of this book coming out. I'm pushing this book really hard because I know that when I wrote Another Gospel, which was a theological memoir of me walking through my doubts that were facilitated through the movement of progressive Christianity, I know that that book did help a lot of Christians have language to describe the red flags they were seeing in their churches, maybe giving voice to some of the buzzwords that they were hearing. And I know that it really helped equip a lot of Christians. I've received so much great feedback from so many of you that read the book. But I also know that it didn't do much to stop the movement of progressive Christianity. Progressive Christianity is growing. It's more popular than ever. It has come into more evangelical spaces than ever. And it's really coming for our young people. There is a whole crop of new progressive Christian thought leaders that are saying a lot of the same things that the progressive Christian thought leaders of 10, 15, and 20 years ago were saying, but they're saying it to a new audience, which is why I think this book is so important for right now, because it's really going to equip students, that's high school, all the way up through college age, young adults, to be able to recognize buzzwords. Like maybe you've heard things like, Jesus is the word of God, not the Bible. That's a progressive slogan. Maybe you've heard we are all inclusive. Jesus was all inclusive and everyone has a seat at the table. These are slogans that sound really good, but when we really dig under the surface and figure out what the progressive Christians mean by these, we realize they're not just really unbiblical, but they're going to lead you into an entirely different gospel, which is why another gospel student edition is so important. So please share about that on your social media. If you go over to Instagram, you can find a couple of my posts about it. You can just share those, or maybe find the one on Facebook and just share that out to your followers, just to create a little bit of a buzz around this book, because I really want this book to equip Christian students to recognize the version of progressive Christianity that's really coming after them. So again, that's another gospel student edition, brand new, coming out October 21st. And now I'm going to take you to my discussion with Dr. Brian Huffling, who is one of my first seminary professors at Southern Evangelical Seminary. Took several classes from him. He's a great professor. He was really instrumental in my faith getting rebuilt on a solid foundation of the biblical worldview. And so much of that has to do with the assumptions we make about reality. Can we know history? Can we be objective about truth? Can texts and words actually be pinned down to singular meanings? And can we even know what people mean with what they say and what they write? We tackle it all in today's episode. So with no further ado, here is Dr. Brian Huffling. Yeah, Dr. Brian Huffling, so great to have you on. What many people may not realize is I've shared my story a gajillion times on this podcast about my faith crisis that I went through. And in about 2014, 2015, I started auditing classes at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And you were one of my first professors, and actually the professor I had more often than any other professor. So I just want to publicly say thank you so much for all the help that you were in that process. And you probably didn't even realize it at the time, because I was just an auditor that was just involved from the margins there. But I remember even a couple of times you graded a couple of my things I turned in, even though I didn't have to turn them in because I was audit, but it meant so much to me that you took the time to give the feedback. Good. So yeah, so welcome. So glad to have you. You've been on the show before, but this is the first time on video.
That's right. That was a while ago.
It was probably 2019. Yeah. We talked about divine simplicity. So people need to go back and listen to that, because that's an important topic. But this is a part of our seminary series. So I'm having several professors from Southern Evangelical Seminary come on to give us sort of bite-sized tastes of what you would get in seminary. And this is important stuff, I think, for many Christians to know and learn. And so today we're going to be talking about objective meaning in text and in history, because a lot of times people will say, well, we can't know history because you can't really have an objective look at history. You can't really interpret text objectively. And I get this pushback quite often from progressive Christians in my comments. So we're going to dig into all of that in a moment. But first, I would love for you to share your testimony with us, because I think it's really cool what God has done in your life to lead you into being a professor and honestly, one of the great philosophical minds. Even though you don't have maybe the biggest name out there, you've debated some really smart atheists, and just a gift to the body of Christ, if I do say so myself. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Thank you. Well, I was raised in a Christian home. My grandparents raised me, and I went to Presbyterian church growing up. My grandmother went to one. It was very liberal, and I ended up doing some of what you went through. I was in the Word Faith movement for a while when I was about 15, 16, and got really involved in that. Followed Kenneth Copeland, Jesse Duplantis, met some of them, went to their meetings. It was very interesting to say the least. Went to an Assembly of God high school, Church of God college, Lee University. Great experiences. Then I really wanted to learn apologetics, because I had my own questions, and also wanted to be able to defend the faith, and also just defend my own personal, if you want to call them doubts or just questions, I guess. And so I went to SES, learned apologetics, studied that. In the first semester, I realized you have to learn philosophy. And during that same time, regarding the topic you've asked me to talk about today, which is objectivity in history, Norm Geiser asked me to write my thesis on that. I was going to write it on something else. Bill Craig wrote the same topic, actually, which is kind of funny. And so I've been in the military for a while now, an Air Force chaplain in the reserves. I've been in the Marines and Navy. And I guess my general testimony is just growing up in the church, having different experiences and beliefs. I never had any wild. I was a pretty calm person growing up. I never had any wild side, really. And but just wanted to really enjoy and learn about apologetics and philosophy and theology and Seminary Seminary was a great place to do that. And I've had a lot of different experiences with chaplaincy and the different denominations I've been in, and again, some of the things that you've experienced yourself.
Yeah.
And I teach for apology online classes as well, and they're familiar with you, and their parents watch you, and they're so I'm now famous once removed because I know you from what they say. I have students who have been involved in the NAR movement, and so I've talked about you in my classes. We just had a real interest in apologetics and philosophy because of that, I guess. And I've been teaching at SES for a little over a decade now, full time.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I love about SES is that every single class is approached from 3 different places. It's approached through apologetics, philosophy, and theology. And maybe a good place to start would be talking about philosophy, because I've heard even Bible teachers that I really otherwise love and love to listen to sort of decry philosophy as something that's pagan. It's not something that Christians should be doing. And of course, they'll talk about the passage in Colossians 2:8 that says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." Here's the issue for me, is that I see a lot of people fall into ditches because of bad philosophy. And I think if we really think it through and follow these things to their logical end, I think people would realize that you actually need to engage in good philosophy in order to do good theology, because everybody has these sort of presuppositions that we bring into what we might read in a text. And if we don't think through what those presuppositions are, then we could fall into theological ditches. And so I'd love for maybe you to comment on that. Just why is it important that Christians think about philosophy? Maybe start with, what is philosophy?
Yeah, and that's the question. I was going to say that very thing is when people say don't do it, my question to them was, what do you think it is?
Hmm.
Because the word just means love of wisdom. And, we think philosophically if we were never introduced to the Bible or Christianity, we have these philosophical questions. All it really is thinking about reality from reason alone and general revelation. So, we see philosophy in the Proverbs and all over the Bible. And there are various disciplines in philosophy. Like you said, science. Okay, there's lots of different sciences. Well, philosophy is the same way. You got metaphysics, which is a study of being and existence. Like, what does it mean to be real? What does it mean to exist? What does change mean and look like? How does it happen? What is ultimate being like with God? So epistemology, how do we know things? Well, these aren't bad questions to ask. I mean, we can ask the question, well, I know that I have this, coaster here, this microphone in front of me. I can ask the question, what does it mean to know that? What does it mean or how do I know that? And even with the biblical text, well, I'm reading it. How do I know it? What does it mean to know it? And where is meaning? The very notion of hermeneutics and interpretation are philosophical, because you think that one person is writing something for somebody else. There's got to be a communication of meaning and thought there. Well, that's going to be philosophical in nature. Well, it's going to be philosophy of language, philosophy of, knowledge, epistemology. So we can't avoid it. Paul did not say don't do philosophy. He says beware of philosophy and bad philosophy. But what's interesting is that in more instances than that, he says beware of bad theology. Be wary of bad. He doesn't say not to do theology. That would be ridiculous. Don't study God. Okay. Well, philosophy is that study of wisdom. So he's not saying not to do it. He's saying don't be taken captive by it. And some commentators think he has a specific philosophy in mind, namely Gnosticism, so you don't get taken into something that's bad there. But as C.S. Lewis says, we have to do philosophy because bad philosophy needs to be answered, number one. And number two, you really can't avoid it. Yeah. Someone who says, I'm just not going to do philosophy, well, they're not asking what do you mean by that, because there's no way to not have a view of reality. There's no way to not have a view of what meaning is or how we communicate knowledge or what it means if I hear I'm not. If I know that, that's just philosophical in nature. You can't not know that. Nature of beauty, nature of logic, these are unavoidable. So it's not that we're just going to stop doing it. We're either going to do them well on purpose or we're going to do them bad on accident.
I am so excited to tell you about Range Leather, American-made craftsmanship from Wyoming. Now, I discovered this company a few months ago. I've already talked with the owners. It's Christian-run, and it's just beautiful leather products. I have a leather clutch and a tote bag that I have been carrying around for months, just wearing them out. Well, I should actually say I'm wearing them in, because the longer I have them, use them, and handle them, the softer and more buttery and beautiful the leather becomes. And so in a world of mass-produced disposables, Range Leather really stands apart. They make all sorts of products, from purses to clutches to Apple Watch bands, jewelry, all sorts of different things. And they also work with organizations for custom stamped leather accessories, like you can put them on trucker hats and things like that. So go to rangeleather.com today and use my code Alisa to get 15% off. Again, that's rangeleather.com. Use my code Alisa. Right. And this is something I was thinking through quite a bit. I wrote a research paper. I can't remember if it was for your class or Richard Howe's class, but I looked through the early church fathers and how they interacted with philosophers of their time. And I found over 500 references just to Plato alone, let alone all the other ones that they were engaging with. And what really became crystal clear was that they weren't avoiding philosophy. What they were doing was engaging with the philosophy of
Right,
their time. They
right,
were affirming what was true, and they were rejecting what was untrue. And what really came into focus for me was how there were certain things where the early fathers were saying, no, Plato got this wrong. And what he did get right, I can't remember which one this was, they even said he probably got from Moses anyway. And almost saying, taking it all the way back there. And it was really just a fascinating study to go through all of those references about, because the early
right,
church fathers certainly did not think that we should just avoid philosophy. They were engaging with it in
right.
a very, very, very knowledgeable about what the philosophers of their time were saying, and then what could we affirm that is biblical and
Mhm.
true, and what can we say, no, this is not true, this is unbiblical. So I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's really important, especially when we're living in a culture right now where truth is sort of in flux. People are defining it in all sorts of different ways. There was recently some research that was done by Impact 360 in conjunction with Barna that concluded that the dominant worldview of Gen Z is moral relativism.
Yeah.
Most of Gen Z believes morality is sort of based on opinion. And so it's important for Christians to think these things through, because you could be taken captive by that bad philosophy if you
Yeah.
don't think through what your worldview actually is. So
Well,
let's start with objectivity. So we talk about things being objective, and we talk about them being subjective. Can you speak to that? What is the difference? And we're going to be applying that to history and text today, but just start with the general concept of objectivity versus subjectivity.
that's the thing that people don't normally do, is define those terms, because when they normally say, well, you can't be objective because you're biased, they oftentimes just assume what they mean by bias and objective. And I think people generally mean by that in order to be objective, whatever that is, you have to be free from biases. But everyone has biases, they say. Well, if everyone has biases, you're making a universal statement. You're saying everyone has a bias and no one can be objective. So in my studies, this comes out as being incredibly self-defeating, because you can't get any more objective, whatever that means, making universal statements about everybody everywhere. If everyone everywhere is subjective and biased and whatever, well, that's just what it means to be objective. That it does not mean, it's not simply born out of your own subjective mind, but it's out there in reality. And we can, if you're making universal statements, and that's just what it means to be objective. So that should go to show that whatever it means to be objective in that regard does not necessitate being free from biases. Uh, so if you were to be free from, if you had to be free from biases to be objective, you couldn't even make those statements, because they wouldn't be objective. But the very fact that you can do that shows that you don't have to be. In fact, I think there was an article or a book called "Objectivity is Not Neutrality."
Hmm.
So for example, if you took the disciples, for example, they go and they see Jesus is raised from the dead on the third day. Okay, they're biased, right? They are biased to thinking that Jesus is alive. Everyone's biased towards certain things. And one thing that Bill Craig says in his thesis on this topic is, well, to be biased and to be subjective does not equate to being wrong. You can have a subjective view or be biased towards something and still be right. I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't mean that you're wrong just because you have. I mean, I have biases. We all have biases. That does not, though, necessarily lead to being wrong or false. So objectivity in this regard, and I think that this is born out of a great resource on this is Tom Howe's book, Objectivity and Biblical Interpretation. There's some other good books by it's called The Anatomy of Historical Knowledge, and another book by that same author. And basically, it is the idea that we're going to kind of latch on to things that are inherently able and universal to be examined. So what is that? Well, that's first of all objective reality. Now let's kind of put aside some philosophical discussions like idealism, where everything's just in our mind, or solipsism, or similar, where everything's just ideas for idealism. And there's an objective reality, like there's trees really out there. The world is out there. Also, we have, in conjunction with that, the objective laws of logic and being, which are the law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, and law of identity. So to make that easy, I guess, again, to take my fancy coaster here that's in all my school videos, is, well, if this is a coaster, then per the law of identity, it is what it is. A is A, it's what it is. It can't be a coaster and not a coaster at the same time, which is the law of excluded middle. And it's either a coaster or it isn't, the law of non-contradiction. That sounds pedantic and kind of elementary, but that's required by the nature of being. It's not just a rationalistic thought that's taught in logic textbooks. If those weren't true, reality would be in flux all the time. There wouldn't be any stability or objectivity to it. So arriving at conclusions that are based on things that can be examined by everybody in the real world, and you by using these objective principles themselves, because they're used by everybody, contra the presuppositionalists who say we can't agree on that. We all use these principles, and we all have the same reality.
Yeah.
So these are the foundations of arriving at objective conclusions, is being able to not just be kind of captive in our own subjective minds, but make statements about the real world and using the same rules everybody else uses. Does that all make sense?
Yeah. So why are they called laws of logic? Like, did someone just stand up one day and say, I declare this to be a law of logic? Like, how do we know that these are universal laws?
Okay. So the same way that Newton did not invent gravity but kind of recognized it, Aristotle did that with logic. He systematized it. He wrote about it. And he didn't invent it. He wrote about the nature of logic. And so we can say things, you can't deny the laws without using them. So some people will want to say, well, we can deny the law of non-contradiction. Well, it can't be true and false. I mean, it's undeniable and it's self-evident. Once you know what they mean, you understand it, and it's impossible to deny because you'd have to use the same laws to deny them.
Yeah. And that's when it really made sense to me, especially with the law of non-contradiction, where you have to use it. In other words, you have to contradict it in order to affirm it. And so that helped me understand that a bit.
So when you have two theories, let's say an interpretation, let's say a biblical text, they can't both be right unless you're just a complete subjectivist. But the very theory of subjectivism would itself be objective for the person, which again is self-defeating. So you try to figure out, okay, well, which theory corresponds with reality best? And you would use what you know about reality and use these laws to help get you there.
As Christian parents, I know that we are trying to be really intentional to give our kids a biblical worldview and teach them Christian values. And so if you're anything like me, you're looking for reinforcements wherever you can find them. And that's why I love what Brave Books is doing. It's a Christian children's entertainment company that helps parents raise kids with character, conviction, and imagination. They've partnered with people who have been on this podcast, like Kirk Cameron and Frank Turek, to create stories and shows that are not just safe, but are actually going to strengthen your child's faith and their values. They've recently launched a streaming platform called Brave Plus that features carefully curated content that is purposeful to avoid that overstimulation that can happen, also to promote positive behavior, but also reinforce biblical truth with just being so high quality, fun, and engaging. So right now you can get 20% off of your first purchase if you go to bravebooks.com/childers. Again, that's bravebooks.com/childers for 20% off. And so why do you think, especially with something like history, knowing the objective meaning is important?
Well, it's important to be able to know it in general about just knowing our past, but for Christianity, it's particularly important because it's historical in nature. I've taught world religion before at different schools, and you've got some beliefs that just cannot be verified or falsified. But Christianity is different. I can grab some of these books behind me and say, okay, well, these claims are made. And like Luke, for example, in his gospel and Acts will mention, dozens of people who were there, dozens of places. You can cross-reference all that. And if they weren't there, then it's false. Well, if you can't even know it at all, then you could never know if it's true or false. So Christianity is inherently historical in nature. It's a claim that this did or did not happen, unlike views that just can't be tested at all. Like, for example, in Shinto, we think that it's taught that the kami, basically the gods of Shinto, created the Japanese island. Well, you really can't prove that or falsify. Well, I guess you could falsify, but you couldn't really prove it. So that's not the case to Christianity. Luke says in his prologue of his gospel that he went and taught to eyewitnesses. He went to the exact truth. And so Christianity is historical. It can be true or false in just in terms of logic, but it's historical. These things either happened or they didn't.
Right. It's like
so we have to know it.
That's like what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, where if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain, and you're still in your sins.
These are real events to happen, not just stories to make you feel.
Yeah, there's no other religion that I can think of that baked something into it like that, where they say, look, if you could prove this historical fact to be incorrect, to be wrong, to have not happened, then everything we're teaching you is false, and just, you might as well just kind of do your own thing. So the stakes are pretty high.
You're making it up. I mean, there are so many details that they put in here that could be falsified. Why do that if you're just making up or lying about it? So being able to know history is important because it's historical in nature.
So let's talk about text, because that is something that we've dealt with a lot in our research on deconstruction. And honestly, this is one of the biggest pushbacks I get from progressive Christians is they'll say, well, everybody interprets text subjectively. Even if we were to agree that there is some objective meaning that's hidden somewhere in the text, everybody is a subjective interpreter. So I'd love to spend a little time talking about objective meaning in words, because if we think about words, and we talk about this in our deconstruction book too, is that words, we have to admit, words do change in their usage over time. For example, there's a Christmas carol that says, "Don we now our gay apparel." Well, gay apparel, when that was written, meant happy. It didn't mean what it means today. You say gay apparel today, and it means something completely different. And that's the first thing people will often bring about when we say, no, there's objective meaning in the text. And by the way, for people listening, text and words having objective meaning is extremely important for Christians, especially because we have the revealed word of God that's written in Scripture. So if Scripture doesn't have objective meaning, then it's kind of worthless because we could just make it say whatever we want it to say.
And that's true. So you couldn't even make that argument if you weren't objective. You couldn't say it used to mean gay happy and now it means gay something else, because you know what those mean.
Yeah.
So this argument is pretty impossible to make without destroying itself. So when someone says that we're all subjective, okay, that's not false, but what do you mean by that? Does that negate any kind of objective? Again, everyone is subjective. That's an objective claim. So that would also mean we're having, if that were the case in an oral communication like we're having right now, as opposed to a written communication, there's no real difference there. It's just the medium is different. One is written down and one is oral, but the words are the same, right? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the meaning. So you wouldn't even be able to have an oral conversation if there wasn't some ability to have some kind of objective meaning. So the very conversation itself couldn't happen. It would be self-defeating in itself. That's one way to approach it. I would just ask the person to use a Greg Koukl tactic, use a Columbo tactic. It's, what do you mean by that? And I think that they wouldn't be able to get off the ground very much. Once you just ask that question, what do you mean and why do you think that? That alone really stumps people most of the time. But even if they were able to provide some kind of an answer to that, I don't think their argument would work without it itself having to be objective, because you're applying that idea to everybody everywhere, which in itself just is objective. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you do that, though? Because you're right, words do change, but the only way we can know that is by tracing the history of the words, like you just said. So let me give an example from my word faith background and everything. So in one of Kenneth Copeland's talks, one of the sermons called From the Cross to the Throne, he's arguing that Jesus went to hell. All right. And he says the word in Acts 2, I think it's 24, says he was loose from the, using the King James, loose the pains of death. Okay. Well, I don't know a lot about that when I was 16, but I had my cousin gave me the theological dictionary in the New Testament, which is very liberal. But I went and looked up that word. I had a word study Bible, and I'm not anything. I just know anything at this time. I just know I'm getting into trouble with all these tools I have. I looked up the word. It was Odin. I looked up Odin in the dictionary, and it says birth pain, and it says what Peter was trying to say there in that sermon was that death was. He's making an analogy between death giving birth to Christ and a woman giving birth to a child. As a woman can't keep her child in forever, at the right time it comes out. Well, death couldn't hold Christ forever either. At the point in time, he was released from death. So the only way we can know those kind of things, though, are to have these tools. They're helpful. So, of course, we need help. We are removed by time. We're removed by language. We're removed by culture. And so we have these ways of going about trying to discern the meaning. We have books to help us. We have classes. We have what you're doing and everything. So I'm not trying to take away from the difficulty of the hermeneutical distance, as it's sometimes called. But the distance isn't impossible. You just need the right tools.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious your thoughts on this. There are certain words that are sort of being redefined under our noses and then co-opted and used in a different way. This is what, in the Mama Bear Apologetics book, Hillary Ferrer came up with the phrase linguistic theft, where a word is sort of redefined and then used as propaganda to make a different point. And maybe I can clarify this a little bit with the word, for example, deconstruction. One of the most difficult things for Tim and I to do when we were writing this book was define the word, because it literally, depending on who you ask, can mean everything from, oh, I'm just having some doubts, all the way to, well, I'm doubting some secondary issues that I was taught. Maybe you grew up Presbyterian and then you start rethinking the way you view baptism and you think the Bible teaches that it's full immersion. And so you move that in that direction and they're calling that deconstruction, all the way to completely leaving the faith and becoming an atheist. And the one thing that I was thinking about as I was studying this and trying to come up with a definition is if the word means everything, it means nothing. So what do we do in cases like, I can think of other words like the word tolerance, the word love, the word justice even. So many words are co-opted, redefined. And then, like, for example, with deconstruction, I could say, well, what do you mean by deconstruction to the person I'm talking to? And they might mean something and I can go with them on that. But when you're writing a book or you're speaking publicly, you can't just allow for 50 different meanings. Like, how would you solve that issue?
If you're the one writing or speaking, I'll try to just be very clear as possible. And this is what it means and what I don't mean. When it comes to the opposite side of trying to get it out of the text, that's where you try to go to what was probably meant there. And you have what people call a range of meaning. Like you go into the basic. Is that what you're asking? How do you get it out of the text or how do you do it?
Well, I suppose I'm asking a question more, a broader question, like what do you do when people keep taking words and redefining them to where they almost don't even have any meaning anymore? And the lack of clarity is causing confusion. Maybe that's a better way to put it. If you care about reaching and discipling the next generation, you are not going to want to miss a conference, which is called Leading Gen Z Conference, and this is hosted by Impact 360 Institute. It's happening on Thursday, September 11th in Noonan, Georgia, and that's just 30 minutes south of Atlanta. Now, this one-day event is packed with practical tools and biblical wisdom for pastors, parents, teachers, basically anyone who's investing in Gen Z. You're going to hear from speakers like Sean McDowell, Katie McCoy. You're going to learn from Jonathan Morrow about following Jesus on social media in a TikTok world. I personally love what Impact 360 does and what they're doing to equip leaders to disciple Gen Z with clarity and confidence. I speak at their programs throughout the year. They're a great partner of this podcast, so I can't recommend this conference enough. Get your tickets today by going to whoisgenz.com and use the code IMPACT360 for $15 off. Again, that's whoisgenz.com. Use the code IMPACT360 for $15 off. And if you're not able to attend in person, you'll be able to access a digital version of the conference, which will be available for purchase after the event at impact360.org.
Yeah, I think what you just said, you'd have to ask the person what they mean. And if you're the one speaking, just be very careful about what you mean as well. Because, I can see people wanting to change meanings to be kind of, deceptive,
Slippery,
I guess, or slippery and everything. So just try your best to be clear. But it still would have an objective meaning to the person, or it wouldn't have any meaning.
Right.
Because if it's completely subjective, then you won't be able to communicate it.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So why? Let's go to history for a moment. There are a lot of people who would push back and say it's not possible to know history. And I'll give you an example from several progressive Christians have given arguments like this, where you might ask, for example, I was doing a public dialogue with Lisa Gungor, who had deconstructed, and this was on the Unbelievable podcast, or I think that's what it was called. It was in 2019. But they asked about the resurrection, and they asked her, do you believe Jesus was physically resurrected? And she said, I don't know, I wasn't there. And a lot of times that's the answer. I wasn't there. And it's implying that if you weren't actually there yourself to objectively witness what's going on, then you can't be sure. You can't really make any kind of statement of objective meaning in history. So what do people mean when they say we can't think objectively about history or know history objectively?
There's a couple different ways. Well, that gets into a really slippery slope as to what history of the word means. And the kind of thought that she would apply there would apply to the present too. So, I mean, I'm not across town. How can I ever know what's happening right now across town? When does history start? Just a second ago? 5 minutes ago? I mean, if you're going to take the I wasn't there and can't know it, you can't know very much. So that level of skepticism really just becomes absurd and unlivable. So that seems like, some people, just to kind of throw this out there, some people want to be philosophically cute, and they just want to sound sophisticated when really it's stupid. Because when you make certain statements, I'm sorry to be kind of blunt about that, but when you say things that you want to look sophisticated and they're really just absurd, you just can't even live. I mean, if you say I wasn't there, for example, I mean, I'm not downstairs in my house right now. Does that mean I can't know what's going on if someone doesn't tell me? I mean, it's just this is absurd. You couldn't trust, and you couldn't have a judicial system. That's part of my thesis. Well, if you can't know history at all, then you wouldn't be able to have any kind of judicial system. You wouldn't have anything. You wouldn't know that the Trump lifted the tariffs a little bit ago, a couple hours ago. When I read on my phone, I can't know that either. I wasn't there. But there are two categories of why people kind of lean toward historical skepticism: the nature of history and the nature of the historian. The nature of history would be, for example, they try to normally contrast this with objective, I'm going to say objective in quotes, science. Because they want to say, well, history is fragmented, it is unrepeatable, it's unobservable. The historian, for example, is biased, selective, value-laden, and to use some more technical terms, is kind of in the flow of history. Whereas if you're driving a car down a curvy road or you're in a raft down the river, you can't see the whole road or the whole river unless you have a higher up view. The idea there is, well, you can't really know history unless you see the whole thing. Well, these are not insurmountable problems, and they might not be problems, but they can be. I mean, there are cases where historians can slant history because they do have biases. They are selective. History is fragmented. You can't observe all things. But that's why historians, just like scientists and other people as well, have kind of guardrails. And they say, well, here's the facts. Here are some of the theories, and here's what we're going to try to say. Okay, what caused this? What led to this? What were the follows? What makes more sense of this situation? So those are the categories, I think. I hope I'm tracking your question.
Yeah.
The nature of history and the nature of the historian. So, and actually, the word history is debated. Is it the actual past itself or the record of the past? Because that's somewhat different. It could be different because you could record something that didn't happen the way it actually did, and so everything about that is debatable. But if we start getting in these kind of skeptical quandaries of, well, I wasn't there and I can't know about Jesus because I wasn't there. Well, where does that stop? Because I wasn't, in China either, but we does not know what's going on over there. If someone knows and we can communicate, and where does that line stop?
Right. And so when you think about bias, because you mentioned that earlier, I was listening to a debate between Sean McDowell and some skeptic. This was many years ago. And one of the things the skeptic said, and I thought Sean handled the question really well, but I'd love to know what you would have to say about this, is they said most of the history that we have on Christianity and early Christianity was written by Christians. And so they obviously had a very strong bias. So how can you be confident to know that this history is accurate when it was written by people that were really biased toward promoting the Christian message?
Yeah, that's almost just true by definition. It's like saying, well, the only one saying Jesus is God are Christians. Well, that's just what it means to be a Christian. You think Jesus is God. You wouldn't expect someone who doesn't believe to say, yeah, this is what happened. He rose from the dead, and I'm not going to believe it, but that's what happened. I mean, you only expect Christians to write a Christian history.
Yeah.
That's just true by definition. You're not going to have non-Christians writing Christian history, number one. And number two, I think that because there's such a radical change in what happened in the first century, one thing that I've tried to figure out, what would be a strong argument to me against Christianity? You would have to explain what in the world happened to Jesus in the first century. Because even if you wanted to argue for atheism or something else, something happened with this guy named Jesus in Israel in the first century, and that's pretty undeniable. So what happened? Well, whatever happened, it caused people who were very scared and unbelievers and all this to radically overnight basically change their views and be willing to die for their views. And that was extended beyond these central people to their followers, their disciples, to other people who became involved in the church during the time of Acts and in the early church. And so that, to me, isn't a mark against the authenticity. It's an argument for the authenticity. Because you do have people writing against Christianity, but again, by definition, they're all going to be non-Christians. So it's like saying, well, all you have writing the Christian teachings are Christians. Well, that's just true by definition.
Yeah.
Only Christians are going to write that kind of stuff, but you're also going to have the skeptics as well. What you got to do then is say, okay, who has a better argument?
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting to me, too, is I was kind of going through some of this early on in my faith crisis, and I discovered Celsus, the second century anti-Christian apologist. And it was kind of interesting seeing some of the things that he was saying. And this is one thing I love to talk about with audiences about the miracles of Jesus, because Jesus was known to be a miracle worker, because Celsus, even that second century anti-Christian apologist, wasn't trying to say he didn't do miracles. He was actually trying to explain why Jesus was known to be a miracle worker. And he kind of came up with this story of Jesus going to Egypt and learning the magic arts, and that's why he was able to do it. But that tells us a lot, right? Even somebody who would have a bias against Christianity to be trying to explain why Jesus was able to perform miracles, I think is something that you can bring into when you're trying to be objective about history. And so how does somebody do that? What are the things to look for when you're reading history, when you're looking at history? Not all history was written right away. Some of it comes later. What are some things we're looking at to maybe overcome some of our bias? Like I know that I'm biased toward the gospel. I'm biased toward Christianity being true because I find it very beautiful. It makes sense of all reality for me. So I want to be honest that even in my faith crisis, I did not want it to be false. I had to kind of talk to myself to be intellectually honest about what would it mean if you do discover that it is false. And that was one of the ways I tried to overcome bias. But talk about that a bit, and what would we be looking for, and maybe interact with how we might overcome biases as we look at history.
Yeah, C.B. McCullough discusses this in his book. Gary Habermas and Michael O'Connor in their books as well. And that's the criteria of authenticity and the criteria of best explanation. So, for example, if you're going to contrast, for example, the Quran with the New Testament, you want to prefer the earlier documents because they were there. I mean, there is something about being there. It's not that even though you weren't there doesn't mean you can't know it. But if you were there, you probably do know better if you were, seeing what happened. So you want early testimony, you want eyewitness testimony, you want plausibility. If there's any kind of embarrassing details like we see with the Gospels, like when Jesus says that something the disciples didn't believe them, or they ran away in fear, or they were cowards. These kind of things. Those are things that you don't tend to make up if you're just making stuff up. And then a theory of best explanation of explanatory scope. So if you have two theories, one's a resurrection and one is a hallucination theory, which is one of the top theories against the resurrection, is, which, if you take the minimal facts case as some people do, or just whatever your own facts you want to explain, which theory does that better? That's called explanatory scope, which takes in the most amount of data in this explanatory ability. And then explanatory power, how well does it explain it? Which theory is more plausible? Which theory is less ad hoc, meaning that which one requires the least amount of just making something up to kind of save the day? Which one is less disconfirmed, or which one is more confirmed by reality and the facts? These are things that we use really just every day. It was the same thing with, say, the assassination of JFK. You got the lone gunman theory, no one else involved. You got the conspiracy theory. you got some facts, right? Certain number of shots, you got eyewitnesses, you've got all the forensics. So two theories, which one explains the data better? Is it the lone gunman or the conspiracy theory? Which one has the most explanatory power, the most explanatory scope? Which one is least disconfirmed by details of the known facts, which is less ad hoc? So these aren't really overly technical. We've put them in these technical terms, but there are things that we use every day. We got two theories about what happened. Could be with your child. Your child got pulled over for speeding, and they're going somewhere. Okay, and they say they didn't. Well, what explains the facts better? You've got two theories,
Right.
and you've got these ways of kind of figuring out that it's not that much different than just what we do every day. Just applying it to history and those kind of does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it makes me think when I think about biases about this people that I trust the most are the ones that will acknowledge that they have biases and maybe try to figure out
Mhm.
what they are because
Right,
everybody has biases. And this is
right,
seen so clearly in the conversation, even about Christians and politics. Like I've heard so many Christians, it makes me sad that it's Christians saying this, but that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics because then you're bringing your religion into legislation. But what do they think is happening if you surrender all of our political engagement to like this secular society? You're almost assuming that secularism is neutral. Secularism is
right,
not neutral at all.
right.
That brings a whole different set of biases in. And so, it's almost like this assumption that only Christians are the ones that can be biased, but nobody else would be biased. It's just the
Right.
Christians,
Right.
right?
Exactly. And since everyone is biased, now granted, everyone is biased, but that doesn't mean we're wrong about our biases. Our biases can be biased toward the truth.
Do you ever think biases could actually give you a benefit to, like, they could actually benefit you in
You
discovering
know,
truth?
Richard Bauckham in his book, I think it's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and I don't have this on page 9 of the book because read that years ago for my thesis. He actually says that in the Jewish community, being closer to an event means you more objective and not less.
Hmm.
We think that to be objective, you got to be detached, away from it, looking kind of from the outside. There are cultures who think that the closer you are involved in it, in this case, the Jewish culture, made you more objective because you had more at stake, you were more involved, you actually saw it there. So yeah, this is itself a debate about how far do you have to be detached or not to be objective. Again, what does it mean to be objective?
Yeah, and you think about the earliest Christians that were the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and death and
Hmm.
resurrection.
Right,
They would have a strong bias, but actually, I think that would, in this case of the resurrection, at least the eyewitnesses of the resurrection, it makes me trust them more because
exactly.
of what they were willing to go through,
Right,
maintaining their testimony to be true. So there's bias involved, but I would think you could almost make a case that that actually strengthens their eyewitness testimony
yeah,
due to what they were willing to suffer to maintain
right.
what
It
they
says
said they
someone's wrong
saw.
because they're biased. No one's right about anything because we're
Yeah,
always biased. Something that this doesn't make any sense. It sounds philosophically sophisticated, but when you think about it and push back a little bit, we wouldn't be able to know anything because
right,
we're all
right,
biased. I mean, I'm biased that this thing is a circular coaster. Well, it
right,
doesn't make it not a circular coaster.
right. I'm biased to believe that I gave birth to both of my children because I was there,
Mhm.
but I'm also correct about that.
Right, right.
Okay, well, let's apply that to text then. So we asked the question, what are some ways that you could overcome bias when it comes to history and be objective about researching what actually happened in history? What are some ways that people can be confident to know text objectively? Because I suspect this is probably something that people are dealing with more just in their
Yeah,
everyday lives. People saying,
right,
"Oh,"
right,
especially I hear this all the time about the Bible, that's just your interpretation. And,
right,
I have my interpretation, you have your interpretation, and the assumption is that there's nobody who can actually claim to get to the objective meaning of the text. And I always tell audiences
right.
this, and it surprises them. But I always say there is only one objectively correct interpretation of the Bible. Now, I'm not
Mhm.
claiming that I know what it is in every single verse. I'm sure I'm wrong on some of those, but there is objective meaning. And that even, I think, shocks some Christians because they've so been trained
Yes.
by this postmodern culture. So, how can we know text objectively? What's the best way to go about that?
So the meaning that we're trying to get to can basically, this is a little bit simplified, but can basically be either simply in the author's mind, it can be in the text, or it can be in the reader's mind in their response to the text. Um, it, we can't have access to the author's mind unless he just tells us what he's saying, and even then we don't have access to what he's telling us. The response is absurd, that view, because that would mean there's no meaning in the text at all. Then why have any response at all to it? So I think that is the right view is that there's meaning communicated in the text. I came home last night. I was gone. I got back about 1 o'clock in the morning from the Air Force. My son had, I don't know why he did this. He's just playing around. He had a little note on the door that says, "We have fresh milk." I'm like, why is there a note on my door saying we have fresh milk? Okay, that's great. I knew what it meant. I didn't know why he said it, but I knew what it meant. So the meaning has to be there and has to be drawn out of the text. If you're trying to put it in there, then you'll never get it. But we don't apply these kind of biases and presuppositional arguments to anything else. It seems like but the Bible. It's like, well,
Yeah.
can I know a grocery list? I mean, my wife gives me a grocery list. Say, hey, go buy these things. Do I not know what broccoli is because I have biases against something?
Right.
I mean, again, how far are we gonna push this? But the way we can kind of mitigate, because there are biases and there are distances. We speak, if our culture, we're English speaking 21st century America, or not first century Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek speaking people in Israel, in different part of the world. So there are ways to go about mitigating this. And that is the English text is rather good. I'm not trying to say we have to go out and become scholars in the original languages, but there are scholars and there are differences among translations. Well, ultimately, we're going to have to get as much as we can back to the original text because the English can differ. Sometimes it's just wrong because even interpreters have to translate. You can't get away from translation. But we can use dictionaries, encyclopedias, commentaries. And a good one, even though I don't love the interpretation, is the NIV application commentary because it tells you here's what the original meaning was. Here's how you apply it to your life. And so there are tools out there that we can use to help kind of bridge the gap, as it were. And say, okay, here's what we don't really understand. And there are even geographical commentaries. Now, Logos has commentaries that are just about the geographical area that says, when he did this and went up here, they would have understood he went up this place geographically, but it might not mean that much to us in 21st century America.
Right.
And what's interesting, though, is we have these books, and we use them at SCS because they're good books in general for hermeneutics, that is teaching how to interpret the text. They'll teach you good principles. Here's how you do this. And when I took Greek, there really are objective ways to, especially in the epistles and didactic or teaching sections, to literally track the argument by using verbs and adverbs. And there are actual really interesting ways you can objectively track the argument that Paul or whoever is making. And you can make a diagram, you can make an outline. But you don't have to do that. You can also use these different sources. What's interesting, though, is that these books that we use, like Hermeneutical Spiral by Grant Osborne, which is a good book about hermeneutics, or an Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, again, good books, but they take away everything they said by, in the back of the books, in the philosophy section, or in the middle in the interpretation section on the interpreter, saying we have all these biases, we can't get beyond them. And they even say there is no neutral interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if there's no neutral or objective interpretation, then why even have your book?
Right.
And are we supposed to be able to read your book?
Mm-hmm.
Are we supposed to read your book, Grant Osborne, and get the meaning out of that? Why stop at the Bible and not yours alone? I remember when I had a debate with it was Bart Ehrman, and I think it was Gary Habermas's protege. I'm tired.
It's okay. Lacona or?
Yeah. So when Michael Lacona debated, now I forgot his name.
Ehrman? Bart Ehrman?
Yeah. Ehrman. Ehrman says that by virtue, and I think it was on the last page of his book on misquoting Jesus, he says, by virtue of reading a text, you necessarily change it. Well, Tom Howe, being the Tom Howe that he is, and the one that we all love and know so well, asked him at the debate, well, if we read a text and by virtue of reading it, change it, how can I know what your book says? And you can hear people saying, what? And you can hear some atheists like, oh boy. And I'll in that section of the room anyway. And his response was, well, that's just the nature of communication. Email me, we can talk about it. He's trying to get out of that because
let's take that into the DMs. Yeah, right. Let's go private.
So what he said, Tom said, I'm gonna have to read your email. So where do we stop with this nonsense?
Yeah.
Putting ourselves. So people who say this want to apply it to the Bible, but not to themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, so the average person might be listening to us and thinking, "That's all sounds so complicated. Like, I want to be able to just read my Bible and understand it." I mean, is it possible for somebody to just read your Bible and understand what it's saying?
That's why I say in general, it is a pretty good translation. And I would recommend a more literal translation, like
Mhm,
the ESV, the New American Standard, New King James. I would try to stay away from ones that are less interpretive and more paraphrastic, or just kind of giving the gist of the meaning. I would say stay away from the Message and ones that are just very loose. So that's what I think that you should do. You should use a more literal, and what's called an essentially literal translation. Again,
mhm.
ESV, New American Standard, the Christian Holman Standard. There's a whole list on those things about what are good translations, and use different ones, and get ones that have good notes. The Net Bible, well, I don't love the translation, has almost 70,000 notes about the text.
Mhm.
I mean, you might have this much biblical text on the page and this much notes under it, but you have to get certain tools. Now, if you're a pastor or a teacher, then yeah, you need to have more sophistication in your stuff. But the average person, yeah, I mean, the English is pretty good.
Yeah, yeah.
There's
And
any debate, it's pretty good.
one of the things and I'll maybe let you elaborate on this as well, that I think is a pitfall that Christians can fall into is thinking that all of the potential usages of a word could be applied in a particular
Yes,
passage.
like
So
the Amplified Bible.
I
Mhm.
was just going to say that's why I think the amplified is a really bad idea because
Right.
you don't do that in English. Like in English,
Yes.
if you take the word day and I say, "Oh, well, yesterday I did X, Y, and Z," and it would be incorrect to apply every usage of the word day to my sentence. Like day can
Yeah.
mean a 24-hour solar day, it can mean back in the day, like a long period of
Right.
time. But I'm talking
Exactly.
about maybe the daylight time of the day that came before this one. That's what I actually mean. And you can't
Yeah.
just go, well, it could mean this because that word has that usage as well. So I
Yeah, you
think the
can't take the
amplified is a bad
entire
idea.
range of meaning and put it in parentheses by a word, so just pick one.
Yeah,
No, it's
right,
gotta be
right.
the only way we had, and that's circular because we get the range of meaning in the dictionaries from the textual meaning in the text. You can't therefore take the textual meaning out and put in another word or another meaning from the dictionary, because then it becomes circular. We get the dictionary meaning from the text, and then the textual meaning from the dictionary. It's got to come from the text itself and how it's used
Yep.
in that very context.
Yeah, and I see that
So
a
it's
lot
pretty
with
simple.
like false teaching is people they'll do like what they're calling a word study, but what they're actually doing is taking an illicit usage of that word and
Yes.
importing it into the text. And that can
Yeah.
happen a lot, even inadvertently when Christians are trying to do word studies, is they can
Yes.
inadvertently do that. That's why I love the translations that have teams of scholars that can hold each other accountable. They can, that helps with the bias, I think, when you have,
Mhm.
rather than a single author translation, you've got a team of scholars that can duke it out and say, no, like this is what this word usage calls for in this particular context in the Greek and in the Hebrew. So
Right.
that's good advice. Any other advice for Christians as they think about objectivity in the text and in history?
Well, I guess it would depend on the specific person's desire, but in generally speaking, I think that just getting a good, solid English translation, I'm not trying to scare anybody away from reading the Bible because they really are good, and you can get the message from a normal English Bible. You don't need to be a Bible scholar. You don't need to go invest in $1,000 in commentaries or books or logos, and those are great, and I would encourage that. But you can get the basic meaning from reading the text. The meaning is there in the text, as long as it's a good, solid translation. So I think the most important thing is getting a good, solid translation. Stay away from the Cotton Patch Bible. You heard that one? That's the Southern
I
Dialect
learned
Bible.
that from you, yeah, in
Oh,
one of our
yeah,
classes.
where Jesus was born in Gainesville, Georgia, I think
Yeah.
it was, and fled to Mexico. Stay away from that kind of stuff. But I think honestly, just a good, solid, essentially literal Bible translation. And I would recommend a good, solid, at least one commentary,
Yeah.
one that's not going to get too much into the weeds. At least give you a good overview, which is the Bible Knowledge Commentary is great for that. You can go a little bit deeper and have a lot more volumes, but a little bit deeper. The exegetical commentary is very good. There's just a whole host, and
Mhm.
I've got videos on that as well because it's a lot of people want to know what a good commentaries are to get. Um, you don't need a whole library, maybe a few tools, a good commentary, a good dictionary.
Yeah.
I would just say get something that's conservative and solid, and not something that's going to
Wreck your
give you a
faith,
liberal.
yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let us know. I know you mentioned that you teach for a homeschool Did you say you teach for apologia or
Apologia online
apologia?
classes. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm full-time at yes, I'm part-time at Apologia.
Okay.
I'm a full-time part-time Air Force chaplain as well.
And don't you have a
I
YouTube
do have
channel? Where can
I do
people
have a
connect
YouTube
with
channel
you?
too. So my main one on theology is called Classical Theology with Dr. Brian Huffling. Then I've got a weird one, as if that wouldn't isn't weird enough, called the Mysterian Files that I do, like a Christian view of the paranormal. I got into UFO kind of stuff years ago inadvertently, and it kind of branched out to more paranormal stuff. I don't think the church does a lot of that.
Yeah.
And it's important that we as Christians address that because it's dangerous. It can be dangerous. And I also think it's a tool we can use to draw people into the faith because if you believe in the paranormal, well, you're only one step away from believing in a Christian worldview anyway, because it is paranormal in a lot of ways. So classical theology with Dr. Brian Huffling and the Mysterian Files.
Okay. So I know we're not doing a whole show on this. Maybe we will do a whole show on this, but what do you think aliens are that people, when they claim they're abducted by aliens?
Yeah, so the basic Christian view is that they're demons. I questioned that for a while until I started reading non-Christians.
Oh,
And some non-Christian ufologists are saying not all of them, but some of them are saying the same things that we are. If I
interesting.
could just point to a book behind me written by I would say the top ufologist, if that's a real word, who says that what these things are beings who want to deceive you and control your worldview.
Mm.
And the Air Force has a book that is an annotated bibliography in 1969. This is from the Air Force that says that what we see with UFOs are just what we would see with the occult and parapsychology and demonomania and demonic possession.
Hmm.
And so when non-Christians are saying that these things want to control your worldview, and what they're saying is not just anti-religious, but anti-Christian specifically,
Mm-hmm.
that might be a good motive for a demon to do. And also, there have been researchers who say that you can stop these kinds of experiences by calling on the name of Jesus. And it just stops.
Interesting.
Not every time, but often.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you didn't you do an episode with Melissa Doherty on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can send people over there to watch that. Well, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Brian Huffling. So great to have him on the show today. And let's remember, friends, as we pursue Christ, let's keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.